thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm Dr. David Pendergrass. I listen to YouTube a lot when I travel because I can listen to presentations and debates and whatnot from all over the world for free, which is really cool. And I was listening to various things, and I saw on YouTube, you know how it brings up the suggestions. And one of the suggestions, there was a video on YouTube by a guy who has apparently over 100,000 followers, and he's an atheist. He calls himself an agnostic atheist, which I still don't understand what that means. But in any case, he apparently has a lot of subscribers. And the name of the video was, I think, something like The Best Argument for Atheism. The Best Argument for Atheism. Now, there are other YouTube videos out there named that, and I'm sure there are books and so forth. But when I saw that, I thought, cool. I wanted to hear what it is. I want to hear what the best argument for atheism is, because I like hearing what the best ones are. And I've read them in Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and people like that, but I was curious what this guy's response was. So what I want to do for you is play certain clips from the video so that it will diminish as much as possible the fact that you're thinking, oh, he's just misrepresenting him. So I figure I don't know how else to represent him the closest without just simply quoting from him. So here's the clip, and I'm going to try to have clips here and there, and I'm going to jump in there and respond to certain things he says, and I'll do my best to, of course, mute out or edit the cussing. So here's an intro for what he says online.
I want to discuss with you guys what I think is the most convincing argument for atheism that I've heard that really gave me pause and kind of gave me that click, the aha effect. You know the feeling when you finally understand something that you've been trying to get for a while and you didn't really get it. Oh, yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. So I'm going to give you that argument in a second here, but first let me just say this. For all the theists who might be listening here, this is not for you, what we're about to talk about here, because this conversation and this discussion we're about to have is more geared towards deists, people who believe in a God, but they already are above and beyond the religion. So I'm going to assume, for purposes of this conversation, that all the theists have tuned out, because I'm not going to take my time to debunk theism, because that should already be a given. This is an advanced atheist's course, if you will, because theism is a belief in a particular religion being true. I can't help you if you're still stuck on that level of thought when it comes to religion. If you're still like, oh, Christianity is factual. I know it.
All right, well, there's an already beginning. To be very clear for those, if you're listening and you're not sure, theism is, theism comes from the Greek word theos, and the ism, of course, means is a particular field of knowledge. It means the belief that, particularly it means the belief that there is a personal God, a God of a particular personal religion. And we use the word deism, and this is where it's kind of confusing. Deus in Latin means God, theos in Greek means God, so they both really do mean Godism. But theism we use technically to mean usually a personal God, belief in a personal God, but deism is a belief in an impersonal God. It's the kind of classic clockmaker analogy where God kind of wound up the universe and then left us alone, as it were. Deism was much more popular in the 17th, 18th centuries and so forth, but it's still around. And so what he's saying is, what he's about to say is not for you religious idiots, because religious people, he says the word BS many, many times. He's not talking to them, because for them, it's easy to refute. It's very, very easy to refute. And here, he's about to give you just a few examples of why it is so easy to refute Christianity in particular.
Well, read the Bible and see how prophecies that they say are going to come true don't come true. That would be evidence that it's not real. Flat out physical impossibilities in there, you name it. The flooding of the world, which didn't happen. If you count up the chapters, the world's only 6,000 years old, didn't happen. Seven-headed dragons didn't happen. I mean, all these things. So if you're not past that, just tune out. This isn't for you. This is a segment for the deists, really. That's who I'm talking to.
So there we go. Here's an example of several things I want to respond to, particularly if you're a Christian, because this is, I think, might be helpful to reflect upon if you meet people like this who are so dismissive of Christianity. The first thing I would say is, it is illogical, it does not logically follow at all, that if the reported events in a sacred book did not happen, it therefore means the entire religion is false. It does not logically follow if a particular event recorded in a sacred text, what's considered a sacred text, if it did not happen, that means the entire religion is false. It doesn't mean that at all. Let me put a fine point on that. If every single event recorded in the Old and New Testaments were false, it still doesn't mean that Christianity is false. That doesn't follow at all. And it certainly doesn't mean God doesn't exist. All of the stories could be false, and Christianity could still be true. Maybe we just have the wrong stories. Maybe we don't have all the details. And as far as God's existence, of course, they could all be false, and God very much could exist. I'm just being hypothetical. If I gave 100 arguments for the existence of God, and all of my arguments were false, God could still exist. So it does not logically follow that it's false. So that's the first thing I'd say about that. So it really genuinely is irrelevant if certain events occurred as described when it comes to the truth claims of Christianity. All it would mean is that the stories themselves are false. And if you're a Christian, you might say, well, this might have implications for the concept of inerrancy, or if the Bible can have errors in it. It might bring up some issues about your concept of whether or not the Bible is inspired and your definition of inspired. Christians really disagree about the definition of inspired, though almost everybody assumes the other person's wrong, clearly wrong because of their view. But it might bring those issues up, and it should. But what it does not mean necessarily logically is that God doesn't exist or that Christianity is false. What about these 3 quick examples? Now, in all fairness, this guy Kyle is not giving a whole long rebuttal of Christianity. So I'm not trying to pick on his arguments or pick on his points. I'm just mentioning these 3 because these are the 3 he mentioned. He said prophecies didn't come true. He said none of them did. Well, again, I would like for him to unpack that to figure out all kinds of things that we do in scholarship. I bet he thinks prophecy equals future-telling event. And that's what most people think it means. Unfortunately, most people are wrong. Maybe 3% maybe of all the prophetic literature in the Bible actually talks about a distant future event. So then the issue is, of the 3%, did it occur? Well, it's amazing that so much of it really did. But nevertheless, he thinks it did not. He doesn't give an argument. He just thinks none of it did. And that would be interesting to hear why he thinks that, when many, many, many people really do think they came true. Even the majority of them did come true. Even skeptical historians would agree that several, at least, came true of that, say, the 3%. The other thing he says is you add up all the years, it equals 6,000 years. That's an old view, and it's patently false. This idea has been around for a long time. In about 1650, the Archbishop of Ireland, his name was James Ussher, he was commissioned to figure out what the date of creation was, and he, for various reasons, he thought, well, I'll just add up the dates and all the generations. Now, the way he added was completely false. In the Bible, it skips generations all the time. It has no problem skipping generations, and it's not always clear what generation means. Nevertheless, he came up with the date of the night that creation existed, the night before October 23rd, 4004 BC. So he was real precise. It's just that the vast majority of Christians around the world, and certainly every single reputable scholar on the planet, would disagree with that. I don't find his dating compelling at all. I mean, so anyway, to me, that's a profoundly simple. I can dismiss that very quickly because no one thinks that. The last thing he said, of course, was this. He said very quickly he said there are 7-headed dragons. Now, I mean this kindly, but this is nonsense. There are no 7-headed dragons in the Bible. My gut tells me that Kyle, of course, doesn't care because he doesn't care about religion. He doesn't care about religious people. He doesn't care about reading the Bible and scholarship. He has I imagine, no scholarly training in the field. So what he's probably trying to do is just throw out a bunch of things that he considers stupid to make the whole thing sound stupid. And I guess to make it very clear, there are no 7-headed dragons in the Bible anywhere. So, all right, let's move ahead. In the next section, I'm not playing for you because it would be a really, really long podcast. He talks more about, and I guess you'll just have to trust me, he doesn't make an argument yet. He says some people get past religious BS, and he says a bunch of things like that. And then he says you kind of graduate to deism, where you believe that there is maybe a creator God, but then he leaves us all alone and so forth. And he says the reason why that can't work is an argument called the fallacy of passing the buck. And so in this next clip, he's going to explain to you his definition of passing the buck and why that fits, in his view, why it's the number one argument for atheism.
It's called the fallacy of passing the buck. Now, we've spoken about this before, but a lot of people haven't heard it, or they're coming to secular talk later than you have, so I just want to refresh this because I do think it's the most persuasive. The fallacy of passing the buck goes as follows. So most people believe in a deistic God if they look at the way the world is and they say, couldn't have been by accident. Right? We've heard this, variations of this, even from like Bill O'Reilly. Todd goes in, Todd goes out. You can't explain that. Moon doesn't make sense. What? But like a more sophisticated version of that, people say, you've heard the argument, well, the way the eye works, everything needs to be in the perfect spot. And, the brain is a supercomputer with billions and billions of neurons and synapses. And, you have 2 arms and 2 legs, and you have a functioning digestive system. And, that's such an intricate design, and everything has to work perfectly for it to work, that how could it have been by accident? That's the argument. When you look over a beautiful sunset with waves crashing on the beach, it's so clearly special and designed that there's no way that could have just appeared. That's the way the argument goes, and a lot of deists believe that. And in fact, I think that's their best argument of, look, it's just too hard to grasp that this just came about without having some sort of organizing force. But here's the problem with that reasoning. Their point is, if something looks as intricate and complex as what we look like and what the world looks like, it can't just happen. It just can't, right?
Okay, let me jump in right there before I keep playing him, because he will skip around a whole lot in his argument, and I'm doing my best to try to help you. So far, what he's referencing is what's called the design inference. A design inference. That is to say, when I look around and see both complexity and improbability, it looks like it's design. Now, those two factors are what people, when they look for, the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial. Have you ever seen that movie Contact, which is, I think, a great sci-fi nerd movie? But when people today, scientists, are looking out in the stars and they're listening for information to come back in radio waves and so forth, they're trying to listen to whether or not an alien race contacts them. And to determine whether it is an alien race and not just background noise, they are trying to figure out if what they hear is incredibly improbable based on what we know about the universe, and it fits a complex pattern. Those are the two things that help people know intuitively that information or intelligence probably makes that happen. For example, it's a common analogy, I guess. If you and I were traveling to Mars, we were astronauts, and we come across a cave, we go inside a cave, and on the cave's wall are scratchings. They don't fit the weather patterns. They don't look like the rock patterns, or if there's erosion or a wind or an ancient ocean. It doesn't fit any nearby pattern. So it's extremely improbable, and it's a long pattern in a row, and it looks like a complex pattern. You and I would instinctively, rationally assume that weather didn't do it, and that someone or something rational wrote it there or etched that in the wall. And so we would infer intelligence or infer design, the design inference. And that's exactly what he's talking about here. So now let's listen to what he thinks is wrong, what is irrational about making a design inference.
Well, by the same logic and by the same token, if you really want to apply that logic across the board, right, and just be really, really rigidly logical about this and strict in applying that rule, well then, where did the God who created all this intricacy and complexity come from? Because by definition, that God would need to be way more complex and way more intricate. Because in order to create all of this complexity, you have to be more complex and more intricate if you have the ability to create all of this and yourself exist and be super complex and intricate.
All right, let me jump in there. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that in order to create anything at all that is designed or complex, the thing which creates it necessarily must be more complex than the thing designed. So, in Kyle's definition of a designer, designers can only be designers if they are more complex than the things they design. And this is quite uncompelling. I think apparently he, like Richard Dawkins and so many new atheists that I've read, think that God is made up of a whole bunch of discrete parts. Like he's got tons of moving mechanisms. So the designer, therefore, must be overwhelmingly complex, more complex than the universe, in order to create. I just don't see any compelling reason, no moral, logical, or scientific principle that tells me that complex only comes from much more complex. I can think of two quick examples. Complex mathematics do not always come from greater complex mathematics. Surely one would have to agree that is not true in mathematics. What about the darling baby, of course, of all atheists, which is evolution? Evolution, by definition, by Darwin and by Richard Dawkins and by everyone who's an evolutionist, would say the great beauty and design and wonderfulness of the quote-unquote design of evolution is that simple leads to complex, not more complex leads to more complex. It is simple that leads to more complex. So that's, I don't know, these two quick examples. One might think of others that demonstrate his belief that only more complex gives rise to other more complex is just really uncompelling.
So that's why they call it the fallacy of passing the buck. You think that you're answering the question by saying everything is so complicated, so it must be God. But what you're doing is you're really posing a harder question, because now you've just opened up the door to, well, how do I explain the God? How do I explain where the God came from, what the nature of that God is, how the God is so complex, in what way is the God complex? And you'd have to answer that question. But see, that's where people, religious people at least, or people who won't deviate from that position, that's where they want to stop playing the game of logic, right? That's where they're like, oh, logic doesn't apply anymore. No, you just draw a clean line and say, God created us, and that's that.
Well, fortunately, I am one such Christian who actually does believe that logic can help us understand things. And to use logic here, I would say that he's being quite illogical. What he's suggesting is well known in the field as an infinite regress. An infinite regress. If I have to explain the origin of everything I give as an explanation, then there is no scientific inquiry, ever. Ever. Everything stops. If I said, back on Mars, you and I are still there chilling, and we said, look at here, friend. Here, I'll just call him Kyle. Let's say Kyle the atheist. Oh, sorry, he calls himself an agnostic atheist. Kyle the agnostic atheist is on Mars with me. I say, Kyle, look at these scratchings. They don't fit at all on this wall, and there's a whole long row of it. And look, there's a complex pattern. And look at here, these scratches. Some of these scratches are identical. It looks like there's again a pattern. I bet this is a language. And Kyle said, so who wrote that? And I'll say, well, I don't know who wrote it. I guess what I would call aliens. I doubt humans have been here. So it must be aliens. And Kyle says, then where the aliens come from? And I said, Kyle, I don't know where the aliens came from. I don't. And Kyle would interrupt me. Well, there you go. All logic's out the window. I don't know. Maybe that's not how he would talk. Maybe he would talk very calm and cordial on Mars. Maybe it'd be different there. That would be pretty cool. Maybe he would say, David, you can't give an explanation of where aliens writing a language until you tell me exactly who are the parents of those aliens. You tell me who the parents are, then I'll believe that some other alien wrote it on the cave. And I'll say, well, what if I do describe where the parents came from? And Kyle's going to say, where are the grandparents from? I don't know, Kyle. All right, I figured it out. Where the great-grandparents come. It's an infinite regress. That is to say, of course, I don't have to explain forever backward before I say, look at there. The most likely explanation is that intelligence designed that. So, unfortunately, Kyle, I don't think I'm being illogical. Unfortunately, I think you are. This is called the infinite regress problem. And I'm so thankful that scientists do not require what Kyle and many, many other atheists do require, which is you have to explain everything all the time, all the way back to the origin of everything before it is an explanation.
But you have to realize how intellectually disingenuous that is, right? Your original argument was things are very complex and intricate, that can't come from nowhere. Well, then God is even more complex and more intricate. So by your own logic, that can't come from nowhere either.
So I've already discussed this. Every major theistic religion on the planet, every one of them, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and you might even include Zoroastrianism, no theistic religion believes that God is made up of a bunch of moving parts. No one believes that God is complex. In fact, God is essentially a simple being. He is pure consciousness. So there is no problem that Kyle sees here. It's a delusion. I won't play the rest of it because there's only 3 more minutes, and he changes the subject, and he has a lot of bad language. But he finishes and says, that's why I think it's the most compelling argument, convincing argument for atheism. And then he changes the subject to the burden of proof, which is fine. But he says something very, very quickly in there about the burden of proof that lets us know more about what he thinks God should be defined as. Listen to what he says, what God is, or who God is.
A God exists, this super being that lives in the sky that created everything in the universe, and he's there for sure.
See, that's really intriguing to me because that's another example of him having a view of God that is unlike every single theistic definition of God that exists. Let me say it a different way, maybe not so wordy. He believes in a God that no one does. And this is very important. If you're a believer, sister and brother, please take note. This is why we never, ever assume that when a person says the word God, we're talking about the same thing. I beg you, please don't assume that. When you have a conversation about your faith, religion, anything at all, and someone says the word God, especially if they say, I don't believe in God, ask them what kind of God they don't believe in. You probably are an atheist too in their definition. So I also do not believe in the God Kyle just described. I do not at all believe in a God who is super creator and lives in the sky, and he's made of a bunch of moving complex parts. So, in that sense, I am an atheist. And I'm telling you in my experience and my reading of all the new atheists, this is the typical assumption. And Richard Dawkins says this kind of thing all the time in debates and lectures and his books, that God seems to be for him just an extra creature, an extra planetary body out in space. And then when we find that he's not there, therefore he doesn't exist. So that's what Kyle's doing as well. He assumes that God is a super creature, kind of like a Superman in the sky. And that's why, of course, for him, it's just a stupid idea. Well, I agree. That kind of God does sound stupid to me. I don't believe in a God of super complex parts, nor one that lives in the sky. Let me say a few last things to wrap up, just to say more about this concept design. So the problems, again, already I've said are there's no logical or scientific principle which states that a complex thing only comes from much, much more complex. The second thing I'd say is, even if the being were more complex, let's assume for a second God was much more complex. He's a bunch of moving parts or non-moving parts, whatever. It has nothing to do whatsoever with the origin of the universe. That is to say, let me ask this question this way. Let's assume he is more complex. So what? What possible reason am I compelled to explain his complexity? Why am I compelled to explain his complexity? And that's what I was saying earlier about the analogy of the aliens. Well, the aliens' parents have to be more complex than the children who wrote that scribble on the cave in Mars. And the grandparents have to be more complex than the parents of the kids who wrote the cave. And then the great-grandparents, do you see what happens? That's the infinite regress. Why do the beings above have to be more complex to explain the thing that we're saying is designed? So even if God were designed, why, and he's complex and designed, why does that mean I have to explain why it is he is complex and designed before I can believe he created the universe? It just doesn't follow at all logically. That is to say, there's no reason to think that if God is designed and complex, that God cannot create. My question to Kyle would be, why not? Why can't very complex design gods create things? I see no logical reason to think that's false, even though I don't think God is designed or complex. I'm just saying based on your definition. Another thing I would say is, well, this is related, but even if the being were complex and he was designed, does this prove atheism? That is to say, is it true that if God who created the universe is complex, it therefore necessarily means he doesn't exist? That is to say, Kyle has one definition of God, that is, he has to be a complex design creature. And design complex creatures are logically incoherent. Well, why is that? Why are complex design creatures logically incoherent? That's what he's assuming by saying there's no way that could have happened. Again, in reality, theists know that God is not a complex group of parts, but he's one pure being with three consciousness. And we also believe he's not created. He's not created. Now, it's ridiculous to demand that by definition, God has to be defined some other way when all theistic religions on the planet have the same basic belief. And if we use Anselm, he's the greatest possible being. So that's the definition of the word God used in theism. And this makes atheists very angry with me. It's called question begging to them. I just disagree with them. I don't know why this drives them crazy. If Kyle demanded to explain why the definition of bachelor equals not having a spouse, if he demanded I give scientific evidence why it has to be that way, I can't give it. I can't give it. All I can say is, in linguistics, we have a word that is defined as the kind of person who is not married. And if you demand why I call that being a bachelor, I don't have an explanation. I just know that it's the best way to categorize that kind of person. Similarly, the best way to categorize the being that could possibly even create a universe that is overwhelmingly beyond imagination powerful, we call that being God. And by definition, that being is not created of space and time or atoms and energy and whatever, because that God, that creator God, by necessity must be outside of the universe. So, by definition, all theists would say, we have a word for a maximally great being. We call that being God. He necessarily exists. That's the definition of being God. So, even if God were designed and complex, and even if God had parents, even if God had great-grandparents, even if God and all of his grandparents were designed, it does not logically follow that the universe was not designed by God. Even if I could not explain who God's parents were and who his grandparents were and who God's great-great-grandparents, if I could not explain that at all, it's still not illogical to think that God designed the universe. So, what's his argument one more time? Complex gods can't exist. My question is, why? Why? So, good news for me, I guess. This must be the worst argument in favor of atheism I've ever heard. It was nonsense when Dawkins wrote it in his book, when Richard Dawkins said it is the central argument of his book, The God Delusion. It was nonsense back then. Nonsense it still remains. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. To listen to other podcasts, go to iTunes and search up A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom. There you can subscribe to all the podcasts. They'll be automatically updated to whatever program you use, or of course through iTunes. Or you can go through my website, davidpendergrass.com. If you want more information about the marriage retreats that I lead, or more information about the consulting that I do, go to davidpendergrassconsulting.com. If you'd like to contact me directly, find me on Twitter at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and I will do my best to respond to your Twitter comment or question, and maybe even address your issue on the air on my podcast. I'll see you online.